Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been curious a little bit about the issue of if when we export natural gas, we're going to see an increased price. And I'm not an economist, I'm an engineer, but I'd probably like to see a little bit more statistics about that, why that would occur, because as you know, we've been exporting 15% of the coal production, and we haven't seen coal prices increase as a result of that. So I'm interested in the disconnect, why coal prices aren't going up, but gas prices will under those scenarios. But more importantly, the other question I have is that under Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 5 of the Constitution, there is the prohibition about putting duties and tariffs on exports. That's been clarified, if I might, in 1996 in the IBM decision, in which it went on to say something to the effect that that same protection extends to services and activities closely related to the export process. So my question has to do with the permitting process. If it takes 3 years to get a permit for natural gas, I know coal has been longer than 3 years trying to get the permit approved over in the state of Washington, in Bellingham, to put a coal terminal there, trying to prevent exporting by use of government authority. What's the difference between imposing a tariff but yet imposing a slow-walked permitting process to prevent something from happening in an expeditious way? How can that be justified? How is that constitutional, I should say, what they're doing?
I'd like to get Mr. Bacchus to answer this, but he's a lawyer, and I notice that he's being reticent. I believe that, and I'm an amateur reader of law journals, but I think I am pretty clear.
I'm just waiting to be asked a question.
I'm sorry. Then I will recede.
Congressman, you raise a very good point. As we've all learned in this country in the past few years, sometimes it's hard to tell a tax from a fee or a tax from something else that may have the effect of a tax. And it may be that under the U.S. Constitution, there might be some issues raised by the lengthy delays in this permitting process. As I advised the chairman at the outset, I'm here today not to advise on policy, but on law, and specifically international law. And from a legal perspective, I'm fascinated by this debate because as a matter of international law, we have long since made this decision that we're talking about today. When we signed the WTO treaty, we concluded then that it was presumably in our public interest in agreeing to this treaty that we would impose restrictions on exports only in some very limited exceptional circumstances permitted by that treaty. And I've heard no circumstances discussed today that fit those exceptions in that treaty. As a matter of international law, right now, with no action whatsoever by this Congress, we have a legal obligation to export natural gas unrestricted to her country and other countries in Central and Eastern Europe that are members of the WTO, period. The only reason that we're not doing so at this point is because they're friends of ours and they haven't bothered to sue us in the WTO. But somebody could do so. At the same time, as I mentioned, our valiant trade negotiators and trade lawyers in the administration are at this very moment arguing in the WTO in not one but two cases against China that they cannot do what these laws we're discussing that we have in place today do. And they are winning those cases as they rightly should. Meantime, more than 1/3 of WTO members under the threats of the current financial situation are imposing more and more export restrictions. This is a form of economic nationalism and protectionism that is illegal as a matter of international law, and the United States, on a bipartisan basis, has been leading the charge against this in the WTO and should.
Thank you. Maybe you can stop. I'd like to carry on this conversation regarding the constitutionality of that. The third question I have is, do you think that this Supreme Court's decision yesterday about the Spruce Mine allowing the EPA to retroactively withdraw a permit that they've given, could that have an impact on our LNG exports? If someone can build the facility, which could be $1 billion or more, and the EPA withdraw that permit 2 or 3 years later, is that an appropriate gesture, or what has happened in the law that allowed that to happen?
I haven't read the opinion, Congressman, so I couldn't advise you on that at this time. I'll be happy to.
But you're
advise
aware
you
of the
later.
Spruce mine where they pulled the mine, that 4 years after it had been granted, 4 years afterwards, that the EPA pulled the permit that they had been granted by the Corps of Engineers. That's a chilling effect for anyone in any business, not just coal, steel, anyone that has a water permit, they have that permit pulled. I'm concerned about what it's going to have on LNG. Thank you. Yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back.